start, especially if we're talking about public cloud services. When you talk about private cloud, the risk exposure is lowered in the sense that it is more secure and very centered on the customer. Now, but the costs are higher. So you have to think about, okay, we understand what the trade-offs are. We understand that each different model may come with a slightly different cost model. Which one is most palatable to our appetite for risk? One of the areas that I think we need to talk frankly about when it comes to the cloud environment is the change agility of the provider. From an ITSM perspective, we know historically, if we look across the industry experience over a period of years, we find that one of the high triggers to incidents and problems, for example, are uncontrolled or poorly managed changes. And if any of you are heavily active in the ITSM space, you probably know that this can be the case. We put a lot of effort internally into managing change in order to minimize the risk to the business and to lower those recurring incidents and failed changes and those kinds of things. When we are talking about cloud computing, we really are hostage to some degree at how well the cloud providers manage change. So when it comes to thinking about your cloud provider, one of the things we have to be clear that we're doing is considering how good our provider, our prospective provider, is at these things. So there's some things you can do to look at and evaluate that. But it is definitely a trade-off that the risk is there, that you are tied to the agility of the provider capability to manage changes. There is often also more customer support rigidity. So, for example, if your customers, if you have a service desk today and you're offering services and hosting them internally, you have some flexibility. You may have service levels in place, you may have protocols and you're using processes, but you do have an opportunity to make some changes for extenuating circumstances with your customers. Sometimes in the cloud environment, there is less of an opportunity to have that flexibility. And your customers should be groomed to be aware that services are being provided in a different way, and that, for example, most of what you may have had first point resolution capabilities on may go away when those services are transferred to a third party. And so the service chain becomes broader. The managing of incidents, for example, becomes a little more complex, and the customer should be prepared that it will be slightly different. So there is some rigidity in the options and the flexibility that you can have directly with your customers. There's no less a need, though, to offer end-to-end services. So it's really, really important that the relationship you have with your cloud providers offers you the ability to have some pretty strong incentives and supplier management activities in place to try and make sure that you are integrating and managing services still from an end-to-end perspective, as ITSM would demand that we do. So there is less direct control from a customer perspective, but there are enormous benefits that in many cases outweigh the trade-offs, and so companies choose to proceed into a cloud environment with great success. So it's not that these are bad things, they're just realities, but they are something that every organization should take into consideration when you're trying to decide whether or not cloud computing is for you, what model might suit you best, and how you're going to manage your customers in a different type of service dynamic in terms of the service chain. So we're going to talk now a little bit about ITSM within the cloud. And what does that mean? So I've heard from a number of sources in the industry that they believe that IT service management soon won't be required anymore because of the cloud environment, and I don't think I could agree with that at all. I think that it's still going to be required, and it may even be more critical because the service chain has become slightly more complex as a result of cloud providers entering into our service value chain. So ITSM remains critical in terms of maintaining stability of the services, managing service expectations of our customers, because now we have added ingredients in the service chain. Managing services from end to end becomes slightly more complex. It's certainly achievable, and we see stellar examples of that in the industry, but it takes some different thinking. So there's a bit of a shift in terms of what ITSM, the role that ITSM plays for us internally, and how we use that to manage services. That changes slightly. So if you have, we'll use an example where we are an organization and we have outsourced many of our services, if not all of them, to cloud providers. So we have a number of cloud providers. We may even have some small private cloud models in operation. We have public cloud access. We're using software as a service. We may be using infrastructure as a service, etc. So what that means is that within the IT organization internally, we're not doing as much hands-on incident management. We're a part of the service chain that in that things are still going wrong. We are still accountable as IT to the customer. We still own an incident from an ITIL perspective at least, but our roles change. The supplier is now providing the Tier 1, the Tier 2, the Tier 3 support in many cases. What is our role? Well, our role changes more to supplier management. The capabilities we must have to be successful at using ITSM in a cloud environment become more strategically focused and more towards supplier and contract management. So our role then becomes one of nurturing a good relationship with our service providers, making sure that those points of integration that we need are there so that we can manage end-to-end services and that the customer doesn't see it differently. The customer experience is still positive and still good. We're still meeting service levels and all of those things. But our roles do change, and in a way that's a good thing. The fact that IT can play a more strategic influencing role is really where we want to go in terms of maturity with IT service management. And the cloud environment is actually pushing us in that direction because it's forcing us to take on more strategic roles within the relationship between the customer and our external service providers. So there's a higher need for integration. And if you think about IT service management and the basic tenets of having people and process and products and partners in place, the need to integrate all of those, including the need to integrate the tools that we use to manage service for our customers, is there. So those are, that's an area I think that many companies need to give thought to when they are evaluating potential cloud providers and how that might impact the need to integrate and still manage services from an end-to-end perspective for the customer. One of the things that does change, I think, with the cloud environment is we need to set stronger focus on getting the right KPIs. If we're managing services internally, we have a tendency to set KPIs that we understand the best, the ones we can translate to business language for our customer, and the ones that we know are signs and triggers that things maybe aren't doing as well as they should be, or we're exceeding expectations, etc. When it comes to using cloud providers, because we're one step further removed in terms of where things are actually being managed, setting the right key performance indicators are extremely important so that you know, as the link between the business and the cloud provider, what those trigger points are for when things maybe need more attention, when things are operating smoothly, and how you can report that back to the business in terms of success. So setting a strong focus on KPIs is extremely important. When it comes to things like pre-qualifying cloud providers, one of the things we want to consider is that think about IT service management as an entire holistic practice when you're approaching talking to different cloud providers. So for example, you want to know things like, do they have governance practices in place? One of the things you want to know is that your cloud provider practices good IT service management, that they have things like governance. They operate to standards that are recognized in the industry. They may even have compliance such as ISO 20000 or ISO 38500, for example. What you're looking for is to find out that your cloud provider understands IT service management, is active and mature in that space. If your provider isn't, you're likely going to have much more problematic end-to-end service management, much more problematic reporting, and trying to integrate with your own internal IT practices. So make these areas something that you carefully pre-qualify providers for. Most of the reputable cloud providers today are getting on this bandwagon because they know that the consumer is going to demand that. So there are many of them and lots of them out there, and you need to have a dialogue about how they do these things, and are they compliant? Do they have governance practices? You don't have an opportunity really to influence governance, but you need to know that it's there, and you need to know that at least the philosophies are similar to those of your own. Now, this next part of this, I think, that probably has the most operationally hands-on impact is the importance of integrated tools. You're going to continue to use IT service management tools internally. That need doesn't go away. You're still going to need to practice ITSM in your organization. But you also now need to integrate with those of your cloud provider. Now, there's some unique opportunities emerging in the industry to do this, but it's something that you need to give some thought to, especially if you have made large investment in your tools or you are about to. You need to start to think about how are you going to use that to effectively leverage and manage your supply chain, because it's changing as the result of moving services into the cloud. So ITSM remains critically required for management of good services with the cloud or without the cloud. That doesn't go away, which is probably good news for you and for the industry. But how we practice it, what roles we play, and the things we need to consider that we maybe didn't have to focus so strongly on before become more prominent because of our move into cloud computing. So I think we're probably ready for a poll question. Are we, Emily?
Yes, indeed. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a quick poll question. And this is really just asking about how you view your organization's ITSM process maturity. So go ahead and log your answers. And while folks are entering those, I just want to remind and call your attention to the question box in the GoToWebinar session. Feel free, as questions come up along the way, we'll try to get time for them at the end. But if you have questions along the way, go ahead and enter them into that question box, and we'll certainly get those and read them and try to get your questions answered at the end. Okay, I think people are still voting. Almost there. We'll leave it open for a couple more seconds here. Okay, let's go ahead and move on.
Okay, you ready for me to come back now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we're going to switch gears slightly. We've covered off so far what do cloud models look like, what is cloud computing, how is it offered, what are the benefits, etc. But we're going to switch gears a little bit. I mean, part of what we're here to talk about today is ITSM and the cloud. Whether or not your organization is using cloud service provision for its business services, applications, infrastructure, platforms, etc. There is an additional opportunity that's coming into play in our market now that has really opened up the tap in terms of access to ITSM tools. If you have no services operating in the cloud, this is something that you may still even be interested in because of the benefits that it offers. We know in our industry that IT service management